Hi everybody, I'm Dr. Laura Eastlake, and I wanted to kick off this Breaking Barriers event on Victorian visual culture by looking at the figure of Cleopatra specifically. Not only is Cleopatra one of the most well-known and widely represented subjects in art and literature from the 19th century, well known as the last of the Ptolemy pharaohs, whose death in 30 BC has often been read as marking what we might recognise as the beginning of the story of imperial Rome, well known as the Cleopatra of Antony and Cleopatra, of Caesar and Cleopatra, who has come down to us as a tempting and tragic lover in many ways, very typical of the femme fatale coding that we see quite a lot of in those later decades of the 19th century. But I want to suggest that Cleopatra is also a rather unique case in terms of the possibilities she posed for Victorian imperialism. The telling of her story has, after all, from the very moment of her death in 30 BC, been held largely in the keeping of Western empires, whether it be the Roman Empire or, as I talk about in my book, the British Empire, which was overtly modelling itself on Rome in that late Victorian period. So 19th century culture is engaged in a love affair with Cleopatra that leaves some really difficult legacies and really tricky prospects for, to use the title of this event, the woke age, whether it be in terms of gender, the ambiguities of her race, or her place in a historiographical tradition that has tended to privilege the learning of Greece and Rome as the classics. So Henry Rider Haggard, author of imperial adventure fiction, had one of his most famous femme fatales, Aisha, assert that empires are, at least in part, of the imagination. So today I'm going to look at what Cleopatra meant to the Victorian imagination and think about what's at stake then in how we write or unwrite her today. Now, Cleopatra has existed and been represented in the British imagination for many, many centuries, through Shakespeare and Chaucer, through the Renaissance, and on and on. But I think there's a moment in 1882 specifically where her significance amps up and shifts. In 1882, British forces under General Garnet Wolseley annex Egypt and set up a protectorate that essentially absorbs Egypt into the British Empire. Now, this is how that event is reported in Punch magazine. In this cartoon called Cleopatra Before Caesar. It's a pastiche of an earlier painting by Jean-Léon Gérôme, Cleopatra and Caesar from 1866. And what it's representing here is one of the more titillating moments, I think, of Roman history, recorded in Plutarch, where Caesar has arrived in Alexandria in 48 BC. And Cleopatra, with ambitions to the throne, has herself smuggled into the palace in what often gets called a carpet, what is probably a bag of some sort, and is rolled out before Caesar. Plutarch says it was by this device of Cleopatra's that Caesar was first captivated, for she showed herself to be a bold coquette. Now, as a result of this meeting, we are told, Caesar places Cleopatra on the throne as a kind of vassal queen and sets in motion events that will absorb Egypt fully under Roman control. So the imperial parallels here in an image like this are clear, especially when you look at the figures in the cartoon. We have Cleopatra on the right. She has, if you can see here, the word Egypt emblazoned on her chest. But the seated figure, do you recognize him? If you look at the two men, the Caesar figure here is very clearly meant to be William Ewart Gladstone, Prime Minister of the time, and the standing figure sort of presenting Egypt to him is General Garnet Wolseley himself. So a very clear parallel of the imperial sort of political events that have been going on in the day, but I think there's more at play here in how this image works. Victorian viewers who knew their history would know that as a result of this meeting, not too long after this meeting, Cleopatra gives birth to Caesar's child, Caesarion. So this encounter then, this visual image, is loaded with sexual innuendo as well. As Bradley Dean says in his really excellent book on New Imperial Masculinity, political and sexual possibilities salaciously converge in images like this around Egypt at the time of the annexation. So Gladstone's gaze here is a political, a territorial one. He's looking at Cleopatra as a figure of Egypt and desiring that conquest, if you will, but it's also a sexualized one. And the problem of what to do with Cleopatra in this image has stakes for his own masculinity. To embrace Cleopatra fully here risks collapsing those Orientalist binaries, binaries inherited from Roman Augustan culture itself, of a masculine classical West and a feminized sexualized East, which are holding the image itself here in tension, but also represent the larger imperial attitudes that hang in the balance here. But if Cleopatra represents Egypt in this image, then not desiring her enough has damning implications for Gladstone's sort of energy and masculinity as a leader of an imperial power too. So we have a gaze here that is at once territorial and sexual, and is most bluntly kind of summed up in this zoom here, where we have the word Egypt emblazoned on the figure of Cleopatra, but directly under her breast, so that Gladstone's gaze is made, I think, almost comedically kind of two-pronged here. And of course, we know that historically this fantasy of the problem of Cleopatra, how to desire her but never on terms of equality, is a kind of safe fantasy for the British Empire, because history tells us that Cleopatra dies at the Battle of Actium in 30 BC, and the Roman Empire under Augustus kicks off after that point, leaving the British Empire kind of free to indulge in this fantasy of the problem of how to desire Cleopatra, that the desire is necessary for an imperial fantasy, but never, as I say, on terms of equality. And that's very typical of the narrative we get of Cleopatra in visual culture, but also often, not always, but often in academic, archaeological, classical discussion as well. So I've chosen just one example from H.D. Trail from an article in the National Review called Our Cleopatra. And this is how Trail talks about Egypt in very similar terms. England is for the moment the Antony of this Cleopatra. Every rising or risen power upon her borders, European, African or Asiatic, has in turn possessed her, and as its strength declined, has in turn been forced to yield her up to a stronger hand. Every great nation in turn has looked upon her to lust after her, nor can she exist without a lover. It may well be that we shall have to break off the liaison at some indefinite future date, but if and when we have to part company with our Cleopatra, let those believe who can that she will provide capable of living as a femme sole, and without forming any new matrimonial or quasi-matrimonial tie. So there's a few things to notice here that are obviously very similar to the Gladstone image and very typical of late Victorian representations of Cleopatra more broadly. Cleopatra's history here is transformed into that same political imperial fantasy, that conflation of sexual desire with imperial conquest. The title itself is Our Cleopatra. There's a possessiveness about that. She is an object of, just as in the Gladstone image, lust. So the subject of an eroticized gaze. Every power looks upon her to lust after her, and her lovers are exactly that, not spouses but lovers. And their affairs with her are liaisons, not legitimate marriages. But it's also fueled by a kind of brutally Orientalist logic that she cannot exist without a lover. Trail refuses here to credence the possibility of self-sufficiency and cultural validity or autonomy for modern Egypt of his own day by refusing Cleopatra in this parallel the position of equality in marriage. So we're seeing here the way that inequalities of gender and race are overlapping in these Orientalist receptions, which of course are not original to the 19th century but have their roots way back in Augustan Rome in the classical world. The other thing about Trail's description of Cleopatra here is that it is almost entirely self-reflexive. Possessing Cleopatra, Egypt, in this description makes her possessor transforms him into the Antony or the Caesar in this well-known story. So here's another great example of that reception dynamic. If any act of looking to the past is in part an act of holding a mirror up to the present, then what British imperial culture seems to want to see when it looks at Cleopatra is itself as a famous Roman general. Here is another biographical sketch of Cleopatra from the Dublin University magazine, which kind of exposes itself in exactly these terms. The author says of Cleopatra, her history, while it shocks our modern notions of morality, attracts us with its splendour and by the worldwide importance of the events connected with it. It's seen as the cradle of human civilization. There, grouped around her, are the claimants for the throne of the world. Under the shadows of the pyramids, with the waters of the Nile gliding past, Pompey, Caesar, Antony, Augustus close or begin their career of fame. So again, what seems to matter most here in this super exoticized, kind of orientalized description of Egyptian history, kind of under the shadows of the pyramids, is that for imperial commentators of this period of the 19th century, when they look at Cleopatra, what matters most is that she reflects back an image of Victorian masculinity as Pompey, Caesar, Antony, Augustus. And of course, as I've said, this is a safer fantasy than we might think, because of course Cleopatra's history as a product of a classical Roman historiography is, for authors like this, very much set and safe. It makes Cleopatra sort of perfectly positioned to take a place as a Victorian femme fatale. She is there to be desired, but also ultimately her fate is to be destroyed. And I want to talk for the next few minutes about some of the clearest examples I've found in my research of those dynamics of desire and destruction of Cleopatra, because of course, if empires are of the imagination, then this is the kind of legacy, the imaginative legacy that Cleopatra has, or Victorian receptions of Cleopatra have handed down to us, and that we need to be able to recognize in how we then rewrite and reimagine her today. So I'm going to show you now one of my favorite examples of this desire element of this Victorian imaginative relationship with Cleopatra, but it's one of many visual and literary representations that share this dynamic, that happen in the wake of the occupation of Egypt and result in that kind of Egyptomania in the closing decades of the 19th century. But if you have ever sat and wondered to yourself, I wonder what Victorian Egyptian-inspired foot fetish poetry looks like, then today is the day, my friend. Let's do this. This is To a Pair of Slippers in the Egyptian exhibition, Piccadilly. It is a poem in the Universal Review, which is a really short-lived periodical in 1888 and 1889. It's a review of, so it's highly illustrated review on art, criticism, politics, kind of visual culture more broadly. And in 1888, they publish this poem, To a Pair of Slippers. And it begins like this. Essentially, the speaker here is sort of fantasizing. He's looking at a pair of tiny Egyptian shoes and imagining the woman who would have worn them. Tiny slippers of green and gold, tied with a mouldering golden cord. What pretty feet they must have been when Caesar Augustus was Egypt's lord. Somebody graceful and fair you were, not many girls could dance in those. In these, when did the shoemaker make you, dear, such a nice pair of Egyptian threes? So every page of this poem is illustrated to this degree, and what you can see both from the text and from the image that sits alongside it here is a dynamic very, very reminiscent of the one we saw with Gladstone and Cleopatra in Punch magazine, in that not only do we have a highly exoticized, highly eroticized Egyptian figure who, as we'll see in a minute, is explicitly tied to Cleopatra, but more importantly, we have that reception-reflection relationship, that we have here a male Roman viewer who is explicitly named as Caesar Augustus himself, as Octavian, as Augustus, who is looking at this Cleopatra-type figure. In fact, on the next page, we get explicitly, "You knew Cleopatra, no doubt. You saw Antony's galleys from Actium come." And in page after page of this poem, we have the visuals are playing out this dynamic of kind of fetishization of the woman's feet in a way where we get, and of her sort of Egyptianness for the reader. Every illustration represents the woman, but also has a male kind of viewer figure sort of focusing on or fetishizing her feet. It's either the shoemaker himself, an imagined possibly husband figure, and then, just to really make it weird, the embalmers who at the end of her life will embalm her and wrap up her mummy. But it's in this final 2 pages, this final double page spread of the poem, where we get these eroticized, fetishized elements of the poem connected most clearly with 19th century imperialist dynamics. On the left-hand page here, we see the woman standing in front of these curtains, and the text reads, "But vainly I knock at the bars of the past, little green slippers with golden strings, for all you can tell is that leather will last when love and delights and beautiful things have vanished, forgotten, yea, not quite that. I catch some light of the grace you wore when you finished with life's daily pitter-pat and left your shoes at time's bedroom door." So the speaker in the text here imagines the woman from the court of Cleopatra slipping behind a kind of veil of the past, slipping out of reach of his academic ability to reconstruct or imagine the realities of her life. Except that the visuals here are doing something quite different, or amping up ideas that are there under the surface, which is that door of the past here, with its metaphorical suggestion of the woman slipping through the veil of death, is also figured here as a bedroom door. So we have the eroticized gaze of this male viewer once again conflated here with a kind of occidental intellectual pursuit of this woman that's made very equivalent to a sexual pursuit. And it's one that for modern readers is made even more disturbing in the closing page on the right hand side here, where we see that this whole poem, its fixation on her feet and her body, is born from what we learn in this final text and the last illustration, born from the fact that the speaker, as he is speaking to us, is in possession of her mummy. He is literally handling the shoes and the body of the woman he is fetishizing. So he's taken possession personally of her, and I will let you imagine for yourselves what his final closing wish here in the last line. He wishes, "One game we might merrily play at Hunt the Slipper." No comment. But we're left to imagine then what that might mean in a way that is very reminiscent of that self-reflexive dynamic we saw in the Gladstone image, that eroticization of the body of Cleopatra and figures like her, allowing the viewer to see himself as a kind of lover, an Antony, a Cleopatra, or in this case, an Augustus-like figure, even if it's an intellectual kind of Augustus. If we compare this image here with the opening image of Augustus as viewer, the dynamics here between the imperial viewer and the eroticized body of the Egyptian subject are very, very similar. It's exactly the same dynamic that Bradley Dean has written about in Henry Rider Haggard's mummy fiction, mummy story, Smith and the Pharaohs, where Dean talks about this tendency to blur together archaeological scholarship and romantic passion. So there's an equivalence made here between the Roman or the soldier of the British Empire and the scholar, the sort of fighter and the writer, the man of the sword, the man of the pen, but they're both equivalent in their kind of masculine desire for a figure like Cleopatra. But there's a darker and more violent edge to 19th century representations of Cleopatra that positions her more squarely in the territory of the femme fatale. So for a British Empire that's modelling itself on the Roman Empire, she's the ultimate femme fatale. Her stand at Actium marks the moment in history where history might have gone a very different way, where Egypt and not Rome might have become the center of classical civilization. And we see that impulse to eroticize her, but also then to very clearly vilify and destroy her in works like Henry Rider Haggard's own novel about Cleopatra. So Haggard publishes Cleopatra after the phenomenal publishing successes of King Solomon's Mines in 1885 and She, which I spoke about earlier, in 1887, and after travelling extensively in Egypt. So the novel is a fictional memoir narrated not by Cleopatra herself, it doesn't imagine that experience, but by an invented character called Harmachis the Egyptian, who is a pretender to the throne of Egypt and who is descended from a line of kings who've long since been deposed by the Ptolemies. And there's a misogynist logic to the way the narrative stance works there and the way it treats Cleopatra. Cleopatra is particularly threatening as an enemy to Harmachis, not just because she is queen and because she has that power, but because she's learned to identify and then to weaponize exactly that kind of gaze that I've been talking about in this paper against her enemies. So when Harmachis describes her, the first time he sees her, he describes her physical features as that face which seduced Caesar, which ruined Egypt, and which was doomed to give Octavian the scepter of the world. He has a kind of prophetic description of her beauty there. But her features are also written as these products of a very deliberate artistic undertaking by Cleopatra. She's described as having chiseled nostrils and bent lashes. So she's transformed herself into a kind of living sculpture, a visual signifier of authority, wherein she is both subject and sculptor of herself as a piece of art. And this is how she tries to kill the narrator. This is how it's described. She lures him into her bedroom, her boudoir, and we get this description from Harmachis. Here were statues of women's loveliness frozen into stone. Here were draperies fine as soft as silk, but woven of a web of gold. Here were couches and carpets such as I never saw, and at the further end of the chamber, on a couch of gleaming silk and sheltered by a net of finest gauze, Cleopatra lay asleep. There she lay, the finest thing that man ever saw, fairer than a dream, and the web of her dark hair flowed all about her. One white, rounded arm made a pillow for her head, and one hung down towards the ground. Her rich lips were parted in a smile, showing the ivory lines of teeth. So, true to form here from Haggard's Cleopatra, she has transformed herself into a kind of living embodiment of the female nude of Orientalist visual culture to sucker in the main character here, to sucker in Harmachis. She weaponizes his gaze against him. So the room here and Cleopatra in it are these kind of highly crafted and contrived objects of art. You get this web of gold. The draperies are a web of gold with that idea that she is a spider, sort of crafting a web to catch him in. And later on as well, she herself is laying asleep. Of course, we later learn she's not asleep. She is playing at sleep here. But she too lies on a couch of gleaming silk, sheltered by a net of finest gauze. So it's evoking that same spider in her web imagery, but also she's literally become here the bait in a trap, in the net that will entrap him. And then finally we get this focus on the lips, that very classic femme fatale, the rich lips parted in a smile but showing ivory teeth. So it's that classic binary. She's voluptuous here but also dangerous in a way that actually is really reminiscent of the other dangerous sort of femme fatale figure of the fin de siècle, which is taking off at this same moment, which is the female vampire. And I'm going to issue a spoiler alert here and say, if you don't want to know the end of the story, skip forward to the next slide now. Because what happens is, according to these Orientalist dynamics I've been describing in this paper, exactly what you might expect. Harmachis is able to destroy Cleopatra, and like the man with the mummy in the previous illustrations, at the end he sort of possesses her body and forces back onto her the kiss with which she had previously seduced him. He's a kind of orientalized Porphyria's lover in a way which is meant to be disturbing partly because Harmachis, for 19th century readers, isn't really meant to be the final hero of this story. A figure of Egyptian self-rule is not really what Haggard is wanting us to admire here. He's a really disturbing character, Harmachis. And a British reader in 1889 isn't meant to align himself with Harmachis's militant rhetoric of Egyptian independence, or with the feminine evil that Cleopatra gets used to represent. What happens instead at the end of the novel is this growing presence of Rome in the second half. Although Julius Caesar has been dead for 2 years by the start of the novel, he very much looms over events as a presence, often in the repeated image of the eagle, the Roman eagle. And then in the second half of the novel, we get Antony as a parallel presence who is positioned in relation to the reader in a way that is much more clearly aligned with the images I was showing you earlier of Gladstone and of the male figure in our now favourite foot fetish poem. So that's really what I think is at stake here in 19th century imaginings of Cleopatra in visual culture and in literature. Cleopatra she's there to be held up as we see here in this painting by Alma Tadema, an exotic, sexualized object of desire. However, at the same time, as with any act of reception, that act of looking at Cleopatra, that gaze upon Cleopatra is inevitably a self-reflexive gaze that reflects back the late Victorian viewer as a hero of empire in the style of ancient Rome. And this is why I think the structure of this painting, the composition of it, is really telling as a sort of summary to the argument I've been making in this paper. Here we have the famous meeting of Antony and Cleopatra in Tarsus in 41 BC. You will know it from the Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton movie. Cleopatra here occupies the foreground. She's draped and surrounded by all of those well-known Orientalist motifs from Victorian painting. But in that negative space, the rectangle in the middle of the painting, what we have here is Antony looking at her. So where we're positioned as viewers is very much a reflection of where Antony himself is. We're seeing into the other side of the kind of canopy gazebo structure that she's sitting under. And we too are invited to share Antony's gaze, his first glimpse of Cleopatra. And so that negative space there, it's at once an opening, but it's also a mirror. It reminds me very much of the structure of something like William Holman Hunt's The Awakening Conscious, which is also playing in the same space in the composition with the mirror. The figure is looking out of the window, which we then see reflected. Really, in the logic of this painting, if the viewer were in the scene, they would be able to see themselves in the mirror, which you can't do in William Holman Hunt's painting, but I think we're very much supposed to do in this painting by Alma Tadema. And what the Victorian male particularly is supposed to see reflected when he looks at Cleopatra is very much himself. In short then, Victorian representations of Cleopatra, the kind of images I've been talking about here, are very much a love story, but at its heart it is a story of self-reflexive love that casts an adoring and eroticized gaze on Cleopatra in order to reflect back an image of itself as a new Rome, a kind of Caesar or Antony. That's what each of these images have in common. For every Cleopatra, there is a Roman general stood beside her. So I wanted to finish this talk with kind of a breath of fresh air, a different kind of voice in this discourse, and one which shows us that these conventions of 19th century visual culture, whilst they are very much prominent in those decades after the occupation of Egypt, don't go entirely uncalled out or in fact unridiculed over the course of the century. Even as early as 1853, Charlotte Bronte offers us a really scathing and really funny critique of the gendered hypocrisy and to a lesser degree the Orientalism of the way that Cleopatra gets painted in Victorian art. So in her novel Villette, Bronte's main character, Lucy Snow, has gone into an art gallery and with typically incisive Bronte wit looks at the following painting. She describes the painting as representing a woman considerably larger, I thought, than the life. She lay half reclined on a couch. Why, it would be difficult to say. Broad daylight blazed round her. She appeared in hearty health, strong enough to do the work of 2 plain cooks. She could not plead a weak spine. She ought to have been standing, or at least sitting bolt upright. She had no business to lounge away the noon on a sofa. She ought likewise to have worn decent garments, a gown covering her properly, which was not the case. Out of an abundance of material, 27 yards, I should say, of drapery, she managed to make insufficient raiment. Then, for the wretched untidiness surrounding her, there could be no excuse. Pots and pans, perhaps I ought to say vases and goblets, were rolled here and there on the foreground. A perfect rubbish of flowers was mixed amongst them, and an absurd and disorderly mass of curtain upholstery smothered the couch and cumbered the floor. On referring to the catalogue, I found that this notable production bore the name Cleopatra. So at first, this passage begins like a kind of moral attack on the figure being depicted. This woman is definitely not in keeping with the kind of Bronte Protestant work ethic. She's lazy, she's lying around in the middle of the day on a sofa. There's that suggestion of kind of bodily, that very classic, I think, Bronte image of large bodies being somehow morally culpable. But very quickly it becomes clear in this section that it's the conventions of this kind of art that are the problem. So all this drapery around her, this is still a nude figure, but there's a kind of blistering critique of that long tradition of the female nude, of the kind we see over and over in depictions of Cleopatra, that all this drapery is around her, and yet, you know, there's plenty with which she could cover herself up, and yet she's being depicted as nude. And again, we get that sort of wit about the untidiness, the conventions of still life painting. These carefully posed and beautifully rendered vases and vessels and flowers are here rendered as pots and pans and dismissed as this sort of litter of rubbish around her. So Bronte punctures that tendency to elevate and justify the male gaze by giving its subject the name of Cleopatra. She's sort of puncturing the tendency to elevate those conventions. And of course, what happens next in this scene, having looked at this painting, Bronte's protagonist, Lucy Snow, is accosted in her act of gazing upon Cleopatra by Monsieur Paul, the kind of belligerent love interest of the novel, who bustles in and says, "How dare you, a jeune fille, sit calmly down and look at that painting?" So it's very clear that what Monsieur Paul has a problem with is the fact that Lucy has somehow interposed herself into these dynamics of the male gaze, the Orientalist gaze in Western art and in Victorian culture. And what he does is he sort of ushers her off to the other side of the art gallery to look at a series of what Lucy Snow calls vapid, insipid paintings of women at various stages, various virtuous stages of their life. A young girl, a bride, a widow, and a young mother. So Cleopatra as an object of imperialist desire is by no means a universal narrative. However, voices like Bronte's do seem to get somewhat overwhelmed in that period post-annexation of Egypt by the imperial fantasy that I've been describing today. And in my research currently, and particularly in an exhibition I've just curated with the Atkinson Museum and Gallery in Southport, you can check it out online and in VR if you're interested, quick plug. I'm trying to think about some of the problematic consequences for those kinds of receptions, those legacies that we've inherited from the Victorians for today, to do with the sexification of Cleopatra, to do with the ongoing need to decolonize the classics, and to think about how we tell this story that has been, from the moment of Cleopatra's death in 30 BC, bound up with hierarchies of gender and race and empire. And this is why I think Cleopatra's story, why a figure like Cleopatra proves in many ways a more difficult prospect for modern adaptation than another of her cultural cousins, another Victorian femme fatale, the female vampire, where the more imaginatively flexible figure of the vampire has allowed her to become a space for re-examining those structures of racial and gendered power, whether it's 2014's Iranian vampire film A Girl Walks Home at Night, or Octavia Butler's novel Fledgling, which move the female kind of post-colonial vampire far away from that dangerously sexy and destined for destruction archetype of, let's say, Dracula's brides. Cleopatra has proven a much trickier prospect, partly, I think, because of that weight of classical historiography, and that for me is what is at stake for modern retellings. I've been asked several times in the last few months about what I think of the new Cleopatra film starring Gal Gadot, and I'd be delighted to chat with you in the Q&A about that or about any other questions you've got. But I thought I'd finish now then with hope for that film, and more broadly, that if, as I've suggested here, empires are in part of the imagination, then my hope is that modern retellings can find ways to dismantle and decolonize those empires that seem to linger on in the imagination when it comes to Cleopatra. And part of that will be finding new reflections, new voices, new facets of Cleopatra's story that go beyond just its intersections with Roman generals and the Roman Empire, so that when we look at Cleopatra in the future, it's neither Roman nor Victorian imperialism that looks back at us. Thank you very much.